everyone, welcome back to the Whiskey Pour. I hope you're having a lovely day today. My name is Danny and today I'm continuing my series of all the Scotch regions. Last time I did Islay, so feel free to check that out after you've finished watching this video. But today I want to talk about arguably the most popular Scotch region. It actually played a really important role in building modern Scotch as we know it, as well as producing some really excellent whiskey. So without further ado, I'm going to pour myself a dram of Glenlivet 15 and let's talk about Speyside. Speyside is a legally protected Scotch region clustered around the River Spey in the northeast. It actually sits inside the Highland boundary, which is why you'll see that some old bottles of Macallan will still say Highland whiskey on them, even though of course it's based in Speyside. Glenfarclas as well, they used to call themselves a Highland whiskey distillery, even though they're definitely in the heart of Speyside. Speyside is a pretty small area, but it has a huge footprint on Scotch whiskey. It actually has over half of the malt whiskey distilleries in Scotland, and that's why it's earned itself the nickname Malt Whiskey Country. Speyside didn't just become this powerhouse for no reason. There's actually two pretty good reasons why Speyside became what it is. And the first one is the Excise Act. The Excise Act came about in 1823, and up until that point, whiskey in the Highlands was made illegally, including in Speyside. Farmers would run these illegal hidden stills, but when it came to 1823, the Excise Act was passed, which meant that distilling whiskey legally was now becoming affordable. This absolutely changed the game in Scotch whiskey, and a local farmer called George Smith, who was from the Upper Livet Valley, was the first person to take out a legal license to create whiskey, and that of course became the Glenlivet distillery. I will say this was not exactly a popular move with the people around him. His neighbours took him as a traitor who'd kind of invited the government into their whiskey distilling space. He was threatened, and he actually carried round pistols with him at all times, just in case, because the threat became very real. Of course though, we all know how that went. George Smith's decision definitely paid off. Within a generation, the area was filled with legally licensed distilleries. It made him a good living, it worked really well, and that was a massive turning point in Scotch whisky history, and it started right there with Glenlivet in Speyside. The second turning point for Speyside came later in the 1800s with the railway. Now, until this point, Speyside was kind of miles away, all the distilleries were far apart, everything was pretty sparse and isolated, so getting barley in or transporting whiskey out was a big effort and not that easy. When the railway lines started cutting through Strathspey, everything changed, because suddenly they could transport barley or coal or casks much easier. They were doing it till this point by horse and cart, so everything became quicker and just all round easier to do. This was such a changing point, such a game changer, that some of the distilleries even built right next to the railway just to make the most of it. Cragganmore, for example, which was founded in 1869 by John Smith, who, fun fact, he had previously been involved in Macallan and Glenfarclas. He deliberately built Cragganmore right by the railway so that he could make use of it. Cragganmore even had its own private siding so that they could roll casks directly from the distillery to the train. Yeah, the railway is a huge reason why Speyside kind of exploded in popularity and influence, because it stopped kind of being remote at the point where the railway started passing through there. Let's talk about taste of Speyside. What Speyside whiskey tastes like. Actually, talking of taste, slancher. Originally, people used to think of Speyside whiskey as fruity and light and honeyed, but these days, when people think Speyside, they often think very rich sherry cask influenced whiskies, and that's because there is a huge amount of very sherry-led distilleries, popular ones, that are based there. This is kind of a side point, but the reason that sherry is so popular, or sherry cask style whiskey is so popular in Scotland, is because back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, sherry imported from Spain was one of the most popular drinks in the UK. People loved it and they imported it in casks. Back in those days, you could import it straight from Spain in casks, not bottles. And when these were empty, these empty casks would kind of sit in London or Bristol or wherever, and Scotch makers realised that this was the perfect thing to mature whiskey in, because it just gave it those very rich dried fruit, caramel, chocolatey notes. We all know and love these, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyway, every time a sherry importer finished with a cask of sherry, the Scotch industry would snap it up. But in the mid 1980s, everything changed because the Spanish government passed a law where sherry had to be bottled in Spain, so it could no longer be imported in full casks to the UK. Suddenly, the whiskey distilleries could not just buy used sherry casks off the docks anymore, so instead they started paying Spanish cooperages to intentionally create oak casks and then season them with sherry, empty it, and send them over. So you are getting the same effect in the whiskey, because obviously the barrels held sherry, but it's not a happy accident anymore. It has to kind of be prepared specifically for this use. So nowadays, when we talk about sherry cask whiskey, we're often talking about sherry seasoned casks made specifically for this purpose, rather than the original sherry casks that were once used. So Speyside's signature sherry style that is so popular now was not built by design. It kind of happened out of economics and trade, but because it became so popular and because it tastes so good, that's why they continued this tradition. And I, for one, am thankful for that. If I was going to pick 5 Speyside distilleries to kind of tell the story of Speyside, it would be these. I'm going to go through them just very quickly, a sentence or two on each. These are not necessarily the best whiskies in Speyside, although all of them, you know, have pretty good drams. I just think these kind of tell the story of Speyside very well. Anyway, I'm rambling. Let's get into the first one. The first one has to be Glenlivet. Obviously, Glenlivet was the legal turning point because in 1824, George Smith took out a legal license after the Excise Act, and Glenlivet is kind of very typical of the light side of Speyside style. It's very fruity and floral, tastes very good. Glenlivet changed whiskey history forever, so that one has to be first. The next one has to be Glenfiddich, and that's because they really created the single malt breakthrough in 1963, when almost all whiskey in Scotland was blended. Glenfiddich took a risk and marketed single malt Scotch to the world. They really created that breakthrough. Whether you drink Glenfiddich or not, you have to admit that's a pretty big move. I feel this list would not be complete without Macallan, a complete sherry cask icon to the whole world. They made their name by maturing whiskey in Oloroso sherry cask. It kind of set the benchmark for the Speyside very sherried style. Nowadays it's definitely much more of a luxury brand, and their distillery in Speyside is absolutely a beautiful piece of architecture. Yeah, whatever you think of Macallan, they definitely are an icon of Speyside. I want to talk about Mortlach, who are known for their very meaty, heavy style whiskey. It's kind of the opposite of the stereotypical very light fruity Speyside whiskey. Yeah, Mortlach is kind of proof that this whiskey region can also have distilleries that have muscle. Do you know what I mean? And number 5 is Aberlour. Their Abunad whiskies are cask strength. They are very, very typical of that really sherried style. They are intensely rich. They are cask strength. Absolutely a beautiful way to display that Speyside richness and depth. Really gorgeous whiskies. Yeah, they just have that very typical traditional Speyside sherried feel, but they also feel exciting, and I love that. If I was going to give you some Speyside whiskey recommendations to try, well, let's start with very sherried style. Glenallachie 15. This is such a gorgeous whiskey. I mean, Billy Walker is an absolute genius. This tastes like medjool dates and dark chocolate and Christmas and ginger and cinnamon, and just, this is so beautifully balanced. I'm a massive fan of this bottle. Glenfarclas 15 is also another lovely one. Again, very typical sherried Speyside style. If you want to try that other side, that more orchard fruit, light Speyside style, maybe try something in American oak, a bourbon cask. Balvenie Sweet Toast of American Oak is a beautiful, brilliant bottle. Balvenie is always so well balanced. if you've been here a while, you know how I always think Balvenie hit the nail on the head for balance. This one is absolutely beautiful whiskey. Let me know in the comments what your favourite Speyside whiskey is. I'd really love to hear. As I said, I've already done the Isla episode of this little series, so I've got 3 regions left, maybe 4. Depends if we're going to do an islands one. I'm thinking I'm going to release an episode every other week, so you'll have something different in between. Let me know which region you would like to see next, and I'll see you on the next one. Follow for more.